Good morning, everyone. I hope you're well. So good morning to European colleagues, good evening to Southern Hemisphere colleagues, and good day to everybody else. Before I introduce our speakers, I have some brief housekeeping to go over. Our speakers will each present for around 10 to 15 minutes. After their presentations, we will have time for questions. Please submit any questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be directed to the speakers during the Q&A portion of the webinar, but please feel free to also submit questions at any time, as I'll be looking through these during the presentations. You have the option to submit questions anonymously if you would like to do so. If not, please include the name of your institution at the beginning of your question so I can announce this with your name. Unfortunately, we might not have time to answer all of your questions, but we will try and get through as many as possible, and it is likely that we will follow up on any burning issues after the webinar. You can upvote questions that you particularly like, and you can also type your own answers or comments to other participants' questions. Please also note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to rewatch at any time on the Society's YouTube channel. Now, let me please introduce our very diverse array of speakers. Firstly, we'll have Dr. James McEvoy from the Royal Holloway, University of London. James has used flipped classroom scenarios and active learning techniques to improve engagement, particularly on a large first-year biological chemistry course, and he will be telling us about how the interventions he has employed on that course has resulted in a narrowing of the awarding gap, which troubles many of the practitioners in the UK higher education environment. Secondly, we'll have Professor Hilary MacQueen. Hilary has worked for many years at the Open University. Incidentally, the Open University won 2 of the Guardian newspaper's University Awards just yesterday and was runner-up in another category, so I feel we're in safe hands. I've been an external examiner at the Open University, so I'm taking all the credit I can for helping them refine their practice. Hilary has been a director of teaching, a program lead, and a student of the Open University, and will tell us how she and the Open University have developed processes to ensure that their diverse student cohorts, often with no prior academic attainments, are enabled to learn meaningfully, especially in online learning environments. So these are, I guess, the world's experts in online teaching and learning. Finally, we have the inspirational role model that is Dayne Beccano-Kelly. Dayne is in the throes of setting up his own research lab in the Department of Physiology, Anatomy and Genetics at Oxford, but nevertheless still finds time to help others. He is a World Parkinson Coalition Science Ambassador and is currently working with the Physiological Society on a project to heighten awareness of ethnic minority scientists, especially amongst BAME, Black ethnic and minority student populations. So I think we're in for an entertaining ride. And let me please introduce to you then Dr. James McEvoy. James, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for inviting me today. I'm really looking forward to hearing all of the talks. The title of my talk today is Active Learning for Equitable Learning, and I'm going to tell you about, as Nick said, some of the interventions that I've made over the last few years at Royal Holloway. I teach in the Department of Biological Sciences. I'm not a physiologist, so full disclosure, I'm a bit of an interloper here at the Physiological Society. I'm a chemist by training, and a lot of my teaching is in a big first year, well, relatively large first year module, so 120, 130 students, telling them about biological chemistry. And when I began this project, and I'm also involved in attainment gap issues in the department and in the university, I wanted to get an idea of the scale of the problem that we had with the attainment gap, with the awarding gap with our some of our students. And the question that I posed to myself and my colleagues was this: what are the main characteristics which decide if our students get a so-called good degree, in other words, a first or a 2-1? Is there a way to predict before our students even begin their studies what the chances of their success are? And I ran the numbers in our department and produced a decision tree which goes through the different factors when the students walk in the door, which predict their success. And very strikingly, I think, the most important factor right at the top of the decision tree there was whether or not our students were Black, Asian, or otherwise minority ethnic. And that's roughly 1/2 of the students in our department. And you see then you go down the decision tree, if those students are BAME students, then gender is also important, and the women do rather better than the men. In fact, very worryingly, when I did this analysis a few years ago, we found that the majority of our male BAME students were not getting good degrees. In other words, were not getting firsts or 2-1s. Whereas you can see a clear majority of our non-BAME students were getting good degrees. So this is, I think, a nice visual representation of the problem that we analyzed a few years ago. I was using a free data mining program called Rapid Miner Studio that we're now kind of rolling out across the school and doing similar analyses. But it's a good way of getting colleagues kind of to understand the scale of that problem. The way that I tried to address this issue in my own classes was by trying to get away from traditional lecturing and sort of passive modes of learning and towards active learning. And the reason is that there's substantial evidence that the more you get students engaged in the class, rather than just sort of passively receiving information, get them engaged in active learning, in solving problems, primarily in my teaching, that has the effect of narrowing achievement gaps. And this is a nice meta-analysis that was published by Scott Freeman and colleagues from the University of Washington earlier this year in PNAS. And they looked at about 15-20 studies which passed their criteria and compared traditional lecturing, college level lecturing, which they described as passive learning, with active learning. And they found that exam score gap, so this is the difference between the white students' performances and underrepresented groups, so those would be BAME students and also widening participation students, as they defined those students in their studies. That gap was narrowed, so it was quite substantial in the passive learning scenarios, rather less substantial in the active learning, and the same was true in the percentage of students who are passing those modules. So panel B shows the similar sort of thing with passing percentages. And as they looked through those different studies from around the world, they found that the narrowing of that attainment gap seemed to depend on the intensity of the active learning. So it wasn't the same in all cases, certainly not. And it seemed to depend very much on how much you were getting the students to think and to collaborate and to work together in their classes. The more you did so, the smaller the attainment gap seemed to get. And as Nick mentioned in his introduction, the way that I tried to implement this sort of active learning model was through flipping the classroom, or at least semi-flipping the classroom. In previous years, I'd asked students to read a section in their textbook. I'd ask them to do certain activities on Moodle. They would then do a Moodle quiz. And then I would then give 2 lectures, consecutive lectures, trying to make it interactive, but, through clicker questions and things like that. But basically, a fairly passive experience for them in the classroom. And what I changed to was this model. So again, I'd asked them to do stuff online, and particularly I added an online lecture. So I basically moved what had been a traditional lecture to an online lecture, a screencast, cut it down, made it more digestible. They were also reading the section in the textbook and doing some stuff on our VLE, which is Moodle. They would do a learning check, again, the Moodle quiz. I would give a lecture. So I wasn't totally abandoning the lecture. I was still giving a 50-minute lecture, but then devoting the second 50-minute period to an intensive problem-solving session where I was asking students to use and extrapolate the knowledge that they'd learned both online and in the live lecture. So I've been doing that for a few years now. This is what the online teaching component looks like. In fact, I've expanded it this year, as we all have. We're making more and more use of our VLEs with COVID and all that. But this is kind of roughly what it might look like. We've got online lectures, we've got our quiz there, we've got other resources and practice resources. There's quite a considerable asynchronous component for the students to work through in their own time online. So that's a mix of videos. We use Panopto for our videos and various other activities. I'm also using those videos for practical techniques, so filming in the lab and also giving feedback on their practical sessions. And then we've got that learning check before they walk into the lecture theatre. And then in the problem-solving session, I've been using some software by Pearson, the big publishing company, called Learning Catalytics. And that's a bring your own device a platform, a problem-solving and engagement platform that we subscribe to. It allows students to tackle questions individually and also, importantly, in groups. One of the nice things about Learning Catalytics is that it can assign students to groups automatically based on their prior performance. So you can ask students questions to work through individually, and then it will create groups depending on where they're sitting in the lecture theatre, and also depending on how they answered the question individually, to mix up abilities, mix up friendship groups, because if you ask students to make their own groups, they will often just work with their friends, and that doesn't always help with diverse teaching. Whereas if you get an algorithm to mix them all up, that works quite well. They tend to obey the algorithm better than they obey me when they're forming groups. And then as they try the questions, which are all formative, they're not summative, they're formative, so that they're there for learning rather than for assessment. I respond to their progress and identify their misconceptions as they arise in the teaching session. And so there's a bunch of different question types. I wanted to get away from the kind of traditional clicker questions, just always multiple choice. So you can have matching kinds of questions like this one over here, where they're identifying intermediates in reaction pathways, and you get this nice kind of summary data to show how the students are doing, so the teacher can see at a glance how well the class is answering those questions and where they're going wrong. And there are various visual sorts of questions where, for instance, I'm asking students to identify parts of molecules, and you're getting immediate feedback. You can find out how many students understand your explanation and how many still don't get it, and you have to work a bit harder to explain what's going on. Well, the result was that when I ran the numbers in the module analyses, this change in approach boosted what they felt was engaging about the class. So this question here, which we had about whether you thought the teaching was engaging, those numbers improved. And also, they felt they were getting more helpful feedback, which I wasn't necessarily expecting, but that immediate feedback that they were getting in the problem-solving session was important to them. And when you look at the written comments, these are from some recent written comments that I got from this semester, then again, the students like having that quick feedback so that they know that I'm gauging their understanding as they're going through the module and addressing that as we go along. And they're also talking about actively doing questions. They appreciate that rather than passively learning and making notes. And there's also mention of the asynchronous material as well. They appreciate the online component. So it's not all about the problem solving session, it's also about the quality of the online materials as well. And the reason that Nick invited me to talk today was also to point out that this seems to be having a good effect on the attainment gaps in my classes. And these are some recent data that we've got, and we're measuring the percentage point difference between attainment between non-BAME and our BAME students, and on a module level. And my modules are the ones in red here, and I can't boast about having eliminated the achievement gap. I haven't done that, but they're smaller than average. Around 2% gap. Which is maybe nothing to crow about, but better than what traditionally we're managing at our institution. It hasn't increased the grades though. So this was the title of the paper that I published a few years ago on this. It engages students, it gives them feedback, it seems to have good effect for the attainment gap, but it doesn't increase the class's overall exam score. So there's no sign of grade inflation, which is important in quality. So why might this be working? Scott Freeman and colleagues, they put forward a few different hypotheses. Maybe our minority students had worse high school training and benefit disproportionately from well-designed active learning, so it boosts their learning a bit more. That's what they call the heads hypothesis. Or maybe it's more to do with getting students to work together in class, so building a better class community, which has to do with minority students getting more involved in the learning community, becoming more confident and motivated, which is what Scott Freeman calls the heart side of that hypothesis. And probably both of those things are important. And the last thing I'll say, of course, is that I'm not claiming that this is any kind of panacea for reducing the attainment gap. In fact, as flipped classrooms have become more popular over recent years, you get stories like this, the flip side of flipped classrooms. It doesn't always work. So it is important, if you're thinking about adopting this kind of method, to make sure that your online materials are up to scratch and lots of interactivity before class, and that we really plan our active learning sessions in class to make sure that we get any of these benefits. Thanks very much for your attention, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, James. Very entertaining talk. Thank you. Very informative. Hilary, could I introduce everybody to Professor Hilary MacQueen? It's my great pleasure to have Hilary talk to us now. Thank you, Hilary.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you for the kind introduction, and it's very nice to be here talking to you all today. And thanks also, James, for a very interesting talk. I'm going to tell you today about the Open University's approach to supporting our open access students. Now, I can't move forward. Yes, I can. Good. Our students at the Open University are really very diverse, and this is because we have an open admissions policy. We have no prior requirements beyond the ability to read and write in our students. So we do have a very large number who have very little educational achievement before they come to us. This is part of our social mission. Our mission is to be open to people, places, methods, and ideas. And our sort of focus on social justice is very much a part of that. And so, given this open admissions policy, we really do get all sorts of different sorts of students with different levels of ability, different interests, different backgrounds, different in any way you care to mention. So, for example, these are data from the last academic year, but actually it's fairly representative of every other academic year that we have. About 35% of our students have one or fewer A-levels. That's the kind of benchmark of secondary school education. For those of you who are not familiar with the UK system, an A-level, that stands for an advanced level, and that shows that you've achieved a certain level at secondary school. And most BRIC universities have a requirement for 3 good A-levels in order to access their university education. We don't have that. Nearly 3/4 of our students are actually in employment. This is sometimes full-time, sometimes part-time. They choose their educational route through with the OU according to how busy they are elsewhere, actually, or at least they should be doing. Some of them try to take on the world and don't do very well as a result. But because most of our students are employed, most of them are studying with us part-time. 25% of our students are from the 25% most deprived areas in the UK. We are a national university. We have students from right across the 4 nations, and we have a very strong presence in the 4 nations. Only 33% of our new undergraduates, so these are first registrants, are under 25. So most of our students are mature students in common parlance. Increasingly, we are getting some school leavers coming straight to us, particularly this year when, with the issues around COVID, the Open University, being a distance teaching organisation, was very much more popular for undergraduates than is often the case, because they weren't going to get much of a social life wherever they went. So perhaps some of them thought they might as well stay at home and save some money and study with us. But that number of 33% new undergraduates being under 25, that's a fairly consistent number, or at least it has been over the last 5 or 6 years. Now, 12% of our students are BAME students. At the last census, the UK average was 13% of the population being BAME. So on the face of it, we're doing fairly well in representation. However, I suspect that things have changed a bit since the last census, which I think was 2013 or 14, and I'm sure numbers have changed since then. So we do have a reasonable number of BAME students, but obviously we would like to get more. And finally, we're the biggest provider of higher education for people with disabilities. And last year, we had more than 27,000 students with additional requirements of one sort or another. And that we are building quite a reputation on our ability to support people with additional requirements. So that's all good. How do we do this support of all this diverse population of students? Well, like many people, we offer access modules, but because we don't have any requirements, even when students do finally come past our doors, a lot of students who we recommend take access modules don't do so. They want to launch straight into the proper stuff as they see it. And some of them manage and some of them don't. So we do always recommend, particularly for those students who don't have much prior educational experience, that they do these access modules. And part of the reason for that is that no matter what students' educational background, they do all have to learn how to learn online. Because everything is done at a distance, it is so far removed from most people's experiences of school, where you've got your teacher looking over your shoulder and helping you along on a day-to-day, minute-by-minute basis sometimes. With our students, they are out there on their own, and the situation for them, their learning journey, is very different. So we have to support them in learning how to cope with learning online. We do when we're teaching science, and obviously when we're teaching other things as well, but I only know about science, we have to work very hard at engaging the students. So we try to teach, it's almost as though we were asking a really interesting question and trying to sneak the science in without them noticing. At early stages, that's actually pretty much what we're trying to do, because we're trying to embed the basic principles of physics and chemistry and biology into their sort of knowledge platform without them being aware that because some people find science actually really quite scary, especially once you get onto the maths side of it. And what we're trying to do is to get them introduced to scientific concepts, to the big themes and so forth, without them getting terrified along the way. So we ask them questions like, can you make a hole in water? And that allows you to introduce basic chemistry. Why does the sun shine? That's the physics. And how similar am I to a plant? So that's basic biology and a little bit of genetics. And, you know, so by asking these kind of fairly easy questions, well, easy, easy to think of, not so easy to answer, obviously, we try to introduce students in a very engaging and gradual way. Now, once we've got the students through their first module, we have found over the years that although students are prepared to kind of tough it out and get their very first module under their belt, there is a very high attrition rate between modules, because the way our registration process works, we let students register module by module. And obviously, if they're doing a whole qualification, there's a series and a sequence in which they have to study. But don't make them pay up front for the whole qualification. They can pay module by module. And part of that is to do with the fact that they are part-time students. Their circumstances may change, they may drop out and drop back in again, and many other reasons. So between modules, we have to be very careful not to lose them. So we have a lot of early start activities so that they can actually go and get a taster of their next module before it officially opens, so basically over the summer. We run things like maths boot camps to make sure that everybody's confident about the level of maths that they're going to need next module. We have websites where we will paste up interesting news stories and commentaries on those, and generally try to keep the students engaged during the period where we've identified they're most at risk of leaving us. We also have a series of Are You Ready For quizzes. So are you ready for whichever module you're going to be doing next? It's a quiz that you take, and if you can't answer the questions on the quiz, or you're completely in the dark, we send the students off to additional material which they are supposed to study offline before their next module, and that way that they will get up to speed. And we have a sort of a support function on the website where somebody will go in and say to them, you didn't do very well there, have you thought about doing this or doing that? So it's all very much supported. And we have found that because our students are so isolated at a distance wherever they are around the world, we offer them personalized support, and we have got a huge number of staff involved in this. The vast majority of our staff at the OU are to do with student support rather than the academic teaching. We have a team called the Student Support Team. It does what it says on the tin. And they look after administrative queries, pastoral matters, any kind of mental health issues to a gentle level that students come up with. And then the students also have academic tutors who will help them with their learning and will teach them subject-specific content. So how do we teach our students? Well, our model is one of supported open learning, and the sort of support that we give is what I've just described with the personal tutors and the student support team. We have got a large part of the university whose job it is to analyse learning, the learning process, and to come up with suggestions for how we can make our modules more engaging, to improve the teaching, to improve the outcomes in assessment and so forth. And that whole set of stuff is called learning design. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with learning design. They have come up with some very interesting suggestions, and we now make all our modules according to the latest version of the learning design advice. So our teaching material is highly interactive, and as James pointed out earlier, that's crucial for student understanding and student confidence as well. If you really, they don't ever want to interact at the beginning, but once they've started doing it and they realize they can do it, then that's a real boost to their confidence and of course then to their success. So our teaching materials are online, and they consist of pages of text with videos, audios, figures, activities, and they're all seamlessly integrated, because we have found that what students absolutely hate is if you're giving them some text to read and then you say, now put that down and go over to this place and watch a video, and then go over to this other place and do a Moodle quiz. What we have done is within our web pages, we've integrated the whole thing, so it's a much easier process for students to work through. We can also teach a lot of practical science, which comes as a surprise to a number of people. We deliver this through home experiments, through lab casts, online experiments where we actually build an interactive experience that students can carry out on their desktop. And they can also do remote experiments. So we have equipment set up at Milton Keynes, which is the OU's headquarters, and students can book a slot and remotely they can work the machine. So we've got, for physics, we've got things like cloud chambers, we've got astronomical telescopes, we've got digital microscopes, obviously, we've got PCR machines, we've got electron microscopy, and we've managed to find ways of digitizing all of those so students can control them remotely. And the student will say, I want to look at say a stub for EM. They've got a sort of slide box and they say, I want to look at that one there at 10 o'clock this morning. And when they come in at 10 o'clock this morning, that will all be loaded up for them. They can control from their bedrooms or wherever they are the operation of the machine, and they really like doing that. And also, obviously, now with the big rise of big data science, we can give them access to databases. We can also give them access to modified, curated databases that are not so terrifying that you just get, you know, what it's like when you go in. Well, I know what it's like when I go in. You just get pages and pages and pages of numbers, and you really find it very difficult to navigate through. So we do a lot of the number crunching for them, and then they go in with a sort of subset of the data and they can do activities with that. So all of that practical teaching is stuff that we can do very successfully, and there's a whole other set of talks to be considered with that. And what we do have, which is a very big benefit, is that we have analytics software that measures student engagement. So for every student, we can log the number of hours they're spending studying the material. Well, I say studying, where it's up on their desktop. So they may put it on their desktop and then go out and walk the dog or something, and that we can't detect that, but we can certainly detect their activity in broad terms. And the big advantage of that is if they are dropping off and failing to engage, that prompts a response, and their tutor can ring them up or email them and say, look, I notice you've not been doing very much lately. Is everything okay? How can I help? So that's our approach to teaching our students. And just some pedagogy to show that this is all supported by evidence. I don't expect that you will believe me wholeheartedly, but there is evidence for all of this. We know that students do feel very much on their own and they need a lot of support. And I know that this also applies not just to distance taught students, but to many students in face-to-face universities. They do come in and they feel quite vulnerable and quite alone. They're not all great partying extroverts. Student motivation is patchy. They've all got lives outside of their studies, and if things are not going so well in their outside life, that tends to impact on their studies. So their engagement may actually be patchy and poor. And that's something that we try to identify by the analytics I talked about a minute ago. And that triggers an offer of support. Now, one thing our learning analytics and learning design people have established is that students working online have an attention span of only 8 minutes. And that's an absolutely terrifying number, because when you think about a standard, 50-minute lecture or whatever, you're just not keeping the students with you all the way. So they'll listen for a little while, and then they'll look out of the window, or they'll check their emails, or they'll do something else. And then they might come back to you, but actually there are periods of absences. So when we're designing our online materials, we make sure that nothing they're asked to do, apart from offline activities where they're working on their own and they can pace themselves, nothing takes more than 8 minutes. We found that if you keep the assessment little and often, students will engage with it, and they will see it as almost a something to tick off in their journey. So they quite like little Moodle quizzes because they're not too taxing at the time, and they can tick them off and say, right, I've done that. I'm the next step along the way. And as James described earlier, so I'm not going to go over this again, the students have got to do something to embed the learning. It's got to be active learning. And one thing that we've introduced with fairly recently, and it's been tentatively very successful, and that's peer assessment. And that is where you get students to judge each other's work. And it nurtures quite a lot of good qualities, because once they've been on the receiving end of peer assessment, they learn not to be nasty and dogmatic and critical and horrid about it. They learn to try and be supportive and to do what we as experienced teachers do, which is to say, well, you did this bit quite well, but had you thought about doing something else? And that's the kind of thing that peer assessment is quite good at instilling into students, because when they're, as I said, on the receiving end, they don't like it. So they temper their own behavior to comply with what they would like to receive themselves. We've only done this on a few excuse me, on a few modules so far, but it's coming along quite nicely, I think. So I've told you all about our marvelous approach to everything and how brilliant we are and all the rest of it. Does it actually work? Well, the OU has taught more than 2 million students right across the world. We've awarded about 500,000 degrees. We've also awarded about 500,000 lower qualifications. So that's certificates, diplomas, foundation degrees, all the sort of sub-bachelor's level. And one thing that we do have that is clearly very popular is that we have a site called Open Learn, and that's the address of it there. And there are thousands of pieces of online learning that are completely free to everybody. And we have a few fans who go in and look quite a lot, but we've had 8.9 million, sorry, unique visitors. So some of those have come back again, but a lot of people have actually gone to use our resources on Open Learn. And we know that some of these resources are used by people in other HGIs, and that's absolutely fine. We don't put very much stuff from current active modules up there, because obviously then the students would complain that they're paying for something that they could get for free. But any old module material can go up there, and so the stuff is reasonably current in most cases. So we would say that on those figures, our approach to teaching and learning design actually works quite well, and we get a decent number of people going through and satisfying their own learning requirements, because not everybody comes to us wanting a degree. Some of them just want, something that's either not got any kind of qualification attached to it at all. So this is the sort of MOOC stuff that we also do. But others obviously do want a degree, and we think for most of them, not all obviously, but for the vast majority, we can satisfy their learning outcomes. But we still have, in spite of all this proactive support that we think we're very good at, we have large attainment gaps for BAME students and also for people with mental health flags. And as you can imagine, the parts of the university that research this sort of thing are going flat out to try and establish why. And they do have quite a lot of data on this, but that's a topic for another day, I think. And it really worries us enormously. Our gender attainment gap is negligible. Our attainment gap with disabled students, apart from the mental health ones, is pretty good. But our BAME and mental health attainment gaps are pretty woeful, I have to say. And I'm quite ashamed to say that, which is a pity, because clearly our approach works for the majority, but there's a significant problem with some of what we do, and we don't yet know what it is. So that's really rather a shame.
Hilary, I'm conscious of time.
This is the last slide, and it's just some do's and don'ts. So if you're approaching online teaching for the first time, which some of you may be, don't put all your slides up as PowerPoints and expect the students to work through them, because they won't. Don't expect the students to engage all by themselves, because they won't. And don't make the conversation one way only, because it's very good to hear the student voice, and that can modify your teaching enormously. Do remember the 8-minute attention span. Do keep encouraging students and verify their participation. Check that they are actually doing what you think they're doing. And do make yourself available for follow-up questions. That's me finished, Nick. I'm sorry I've run over a little bit, but I'll be happy to look at questions afterwards. Thank you.
But it was fantastic. Thank you very much, Hilary. It was a fantastic presentation. It was lovely. If we could stop sharing the screen now, then we can let Dayne Beccano-Kelly, last but definitely not least, to finish this off with a flourish. Colleagues, we may run a little bit over time, but I think the FysSoc will allow us an extra 5 minutes, so we can go 5 minutes after the hour to allow some time for questions, which we're getting a lot through at the minute through the chat. Thank you for that. Dayne, I'll leave everybody in your safe hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, I think we'll get back on track here. Thank you very much, Nick, for the invitation to speak with my esteemed colleagues today. The reason I say I'll get back on track is because I'm going to take a very different tact from what my colleagues spoke about in terms of teaching, because I don't do that as yet, but much more about encouraging entry into the university. And I'm going to be very short, which is why I say I'm going to get us back onto timeline tracks. So I just wanted to speak from my own personal experiences about what I think would have benefited me and how I think we can move forwards and push forwards, and the things that I'm trying to do to help increase BAME in STEM. So I'm currently a career development fellow at the University of Oxford, but I've just been awarded a UKRI FLF fellowship in order to start my own research group in Cardiff. And I've been working in academic research in some capacity since about 2004, and have traveled and worked in various brilliant institutions all over the world. And as a result, I've garnered a fabulous array of mentors who've really sort of guided me and helped me on my academic path. And I do stress mentors because I've collected a few, and I think it's really important to have a wide variety and a wide set of mentors to help you gain various different points of view in order to tackle the very different challenges that one may encounter in the academic path. And I believe that the mentorship from senior individuals, from my personal experience, is increased, or has increased my preparedness, my enthusiasm, and my ability to take on STEM. And I think that I've had some fantastic people that have helped me on all of those levels, both male and female mentors who have taken me under the wing and shown me the wonder of science and how to traverse the academic world. However, as fantastic as they all were, and they were, I must stress, they were all brilliant, they were all senior white academic individuals. And as a Black scientist, I have found that I have encountered racism in academia, both blatant and verbal, as well as subtle and subversive. And I have encountered things like, and feelings, as we were talking a bit about earlier, like isolation, being the only Black individual in a department, let alone a laboratory. And this would have been critical to have someone who had had a shared life experience and could stand as a role model and a testament to the ability of being able to do something like that. Discussing it often can make people feel uncomfortable and results in it either being dismissed or avoided. But I was lucky enough to have mentors who were completely fine having those conversations. And whilst they may not have expressly understood my particular point of view or the challenges that I was facing, they enabled me to feel valued, heard, and feel like a capable scientist. And so in the grand scheme of things, to address the situation, we need a normalization of the situation as something where I'm no longer viewed as a demographic, as a Black scientist, but just as a scientist. And this is, it's something like in the region of 6% of students enrolled onto STEM subjects in universities are identified as Black, but by the time we get to the upper echelons, it's about 0.2% are professors and 0.4% are researchers, and we need to remove this as a point from the narrative. We need to make it simply just not a talking point anymore. And there's some key points that we can do in my opinion, that we can do in order to really address this and try and change this, and that's to increase visibility, to increase the encouragement we give to those individuals at young ages. And I think that's another critical point, is that we need to do this at very young ages, and to increase education on the subject. And so in order to increase visibility, we need more Black scientists. And in order to do that, one of the things that we can do is to show young Black students encouragement, and show them that the way to academic research is not barred to them, whether or not that comes from seeing individuals within the upper status and within those upper echelons, or whether or not it comes from peers telling them that this isn't a possibility. And I think that if we have and increase the number of mentors that go out into the community, into talking to students at young ages, we can really educate them that people have gone before them, that this way is the way into academic research and into academia itself isn't barred to them at all. So engagement with young people and giving them mentorship will help them feel a sort of sense of belonging, I believe, in the community. It would have and did with myself, with my mentors, and it will help them to decide that career path and that academia in general is actually for them, and that will help sort of top load the issue, bring more Black individuals, more BAME individuals into the university in the first place, which is a definite issue and problem that is there. And so I believe that there are schemes that we can do and that we can try and engage with to really increase the number of individuals that are engaging with STEM. And one of those is one I've been working with, and I will attempt to share my slide now, just to show you a bit about. Sorry, I apologise. About one of the schemes that we're actually trying to do right now, which is the Aspiring Black Physiology Award. And this is an award that we've set up in order to really encourage students at a young age, or at ages that are prior to entry into the universities, to get them to write about and to learn about scientists, ethnicity in STEM, and ethnic research within physiology. And the scheme, this particular scheme, whilst currently only in the UK and currently aimed at 16 to 19-year-olds, is geared towards understanding that science has had BAME and Black individuals in it before, Black scientists, famous Black scientists, and to put them in a position where they can see themselves as being one of those and joining one of those. So one of the critical components of parts of the actual competition itself is to put a future direction statement in it, to really understand and put themselves in a position where they can see themselves as being a physiologist and taking this forward. So really trying to try and engage them with the idea and the mindset that they too can become part of this scientific collective and this community. And so without my own excellent mentors treating me just as a scientist and mentee, my career might have turned out completely differently. And the engagement that they provided me with really instilled that sense of citizenship in the scientific community. And I think that that's what we as teachers, as academics, really need to do, is to begin to engage with students prior to entering into the university, to show them that there is the ability to actually enter into it with us. And much more is needed to fight this problem. So I'm really a big advocate of trying to encourage the youth to enter into the system. I'm really believing that part of the problem that we need to do is to address this at early ages, and so that we can increase the numbers and normalize the whole situation in the first place. And so I'd just like to wrap up by saying that I think that there is an enormous impact that we can have on young individuals at a critical stage of their progress, and that the decision making and the process of becoming a future academic and picking the courses that they do can be done and helped and assisted by us as mentors engaging with young individuals. And I would encourage you to go and look at the webpage that I have on the screen to just get an idea of maybe courses that you can design and engage with those individuals. Thank you very much.
Could you stop sharing the screen now, please, Dayne? Lovely. So, colleagues, thank you very much for your presentations. Each of them was fantastic in their own very different ways. I propose that we have a Q&A session now, which will last till about 10:05. I've been writing down the questions that have been posted in the Q&A, and I propose that we start off with Dayne and work backwards. So we have the talk recently in our mind from Dayne, and then we'll be reinvigorated by James's recapitulation at the end. So Dayne, Terence Allen has asked, how can we increase the transparency of the progression pipeline by using white allies? You're on mute, Dayne.
I apologize. I just went straight to being
You're doing as you're told.
Yeah. So thank you very much for the question. I really do believe that one of the things I was trying to stress is that whilst it would be really powerful to have more and more Black individuals, as it was previously with increasing the level of female scientists, and which is still needed. It is also important to note that this isn't just a Black issue or a BAME issue. We really do need individuals from all ethnicities to actually engage with individuals to show them that this isn't a problem. So to increase the transparency, I think that it's important to acknowledge and be open to discussing it and be willing to learn as well. So as fantastic mentors, would always be happy to sit down with me and to listen to any problems or challenges that I was facing, and would actually, without being too what's the word, narcissistic, would learn from my experiences and would learn what it would be like to be in my shoes. And I think that then a few of them took it and told other individuals, told their staff, and told in fact their superiors. And I think that that's a very big part of it. I think there needs to be some level of information that tracks up. If you put a challenge or a barrier up and you have a problem, it needs to be flagged, and there needs to be a passed up system, and that needs to be something that's ingrained into our departmental systems, I think.
So Dayne, I have a question myself, if you'll bear with me. So I'm acutely aware that I'm male, pale and stale, but I'm aware in the literature there's out there in the wider environment, there's quite an intense debate about the utility of the phrase BAME Is it useful because it lumps together very heterogeneous groups of individuals? So do you think it's a useful term to have at this stage?
You've thrown a very hot question at me. It's I'll try and handle it with care. From my personal perspective, it's quite an interesting one, and I'll try and keep my answer short because I know that we've got multiple questions come through. BAME, I think, is an interesting one. I think it can be used as an empowerment thing. I think it does group together individuals that have had challenges. However, myself and Professor MacQueen here may well have encountered challenges within our lifetime, but to group us together is a misnomer because the challenges we will have faced will have been very different. So I think it is important to have BAME in order to generate usable statistics, but I think that in of itself also that you need to also have the breakdown. You do need to have the ability to talk specifically about Black scientists, about Asian scientists, about any other minority ethnic grouped scientists, because to have all of that grouped together allows us to sort of miss individual sets of problems and specific challenges. And so I think both phrases are very important to use, but I think the context in which they are used is critical. So if we're talking about numbers or going up or down of numbers of students within academia, we really need to break that down because certain drops or increases can be hidden by the sort of general amalgamation of a BAME grouping.
Thank you for that, Dayne. Very, very good answer of a politically contentious question in a UK environment at the minute. Can I move on now to Hilary? I had loads of questions to ask Hilary myself, but I'll give the floor to some colleagues who posted up in the chat. So Chris from UAE asks about the pros and cons of experimental simulation. And lots of the questions about these experimental simulations, Hilary. What platforms and software are used for the remote practical teaching? Asks Katerina Lamba. And Stephen Land also says, what about the cost of development? There must be a considerable investment in planning in terms of time and money. So could you answer those general questions about how you would put up remote digital experimentation, the logistics and the time and the expense?
I can talk about the time and expense. I'm on very shaky ground when it comes to the platform and the technical pros and cons of things, because I simply don't know about that. I know that it is all now web-based. So originally some of our stuff used Flash and things like that, and we don't do that anymore because it dates too quickly. So it's all done on the web. It costs an enormous amount. I mean, it's hundreds and thousands of pounds. It's a huge investment to set up something like that from scratch. You need very skilled programmers, and we have a load of them, but they keep going off to people who'll pay them more than we do. So we have quite a turnover of programmers, but you really do need a programmer who understands the science, because if you say to them, for example, I want to develop a 96 well plate assay, they'll sort of give you 96 wells, but they won't necessarily be in the right configuration, or, you know, there are all kinds of places where they can trip up. So you need the scientists and the programmers working very, very closely hand in hand. If anybody sorry, if anybody wants to follow up on that, I can put you in touch with some of our programming people who can probably give you better advice. We have entered into some commercial arrangements with other higher education institutes where they tell us, we have a number of assets that we can sell you or loan you or whatever straight away, but if you want something that's very specific, we might be able to help in some way, but there's a sort of commercial arrangement to be entered into. What was the pros and cons? Well, from our point of view, it's very nearly all pro, because teaching science online has always had the barrier of the practical work to get over. And we think that we are now in a position where we can teach all aspects of practical science apart from the actual haptic, the touchy-feely stuff. So you can tell people about micropipettes and how to calibrate them and how to use them, but that feeling of actually depressing the plunger and then sucking it up, you can't mimic that online yet. We have had some projects looking at that, where there's been all kinds of gloves available and all that sort of stuff, and it doesn't work properly yet. Maybe once technology improves a little bit, it will. But aside from that haptic thing, and in fact, if you think about it, very little in a modern lab actually requires you to be very hands-on. A lot of it is stuff like putting cuvettes into machines and adjusting wavelengths or something. All of that kind of adjustment stuff can be done automatically. And in fact, turning a button on an actual machine is not dissimilar in terms of mental cognitive processes from actually twiddling around with your cursor to try and get things to move up or down. So that side of things actually, we think, works very well. And we have data from our graduates who have gone in to be lab workers, and they say actually that the preparation that they've had from the online science has been fine. And they spend quarter of an hour on day one learning how to pipette properly. And I mean, we do get students in to do hands-on stuff. We do some face-to-face practical teaching, but by and large, I think we're not 100%, but pretty much up there actually these days. I'm sorry, did that ramble on?
No, that's fine. That's very good answer, very to the point. I think you answered our colleagues' questions very well. Thank you, Hilary. So James, can I turn to you then? And we have two questions from the floor, one of them quite specific and one quite general. So James, Shakil Chowdhury asks, your BAME population seems to be improving in your metrics, but the grade average for the whole class was similar. So does that mean that the non-BAME students were achieving less well due to your interventions?
Yeah, that's a good observation. Yeah, I was hoping nobody would spot that. Yeah, it's actually true that we lost some of the most high achieving white students over the period of that kind of quasi experiment. And my explanation there is that, as always with any pedagogical experiment, it's a very imperfect experimental setup. And actually, looking at the A-level grades of our incoming students, you notice that there were changes over that period when I was making that change in my teaching practice. So we were getting fewer students from access courses, but we were also getting fewer A-star students coming in as well. And I think it's that drop off with A-star students at Royal Holloway at our department, which is probably to blame for that, for the removal of those high outliers, that we were having when I started off at Royal Holloway. That's my excuse anyway.
Thank you, James. Could I ask you a question then from Catherine Brown, who asks, who says that she's struggling with collaborative learning this year with social distancing, and especially in terms of doing online workshops. Do you have any tips on how to overcome this?
It's a different experience, isn't it? And a lot of my experience before this year was running these problem-solving sessions in a classroom. I could be walking around, looking over people's shoulders, having conversations face to face. You could get students in groups, and doing everything online really is a different experience, isn't it? I suppose my main advice would be to use chat as much as possible. It's very difficult to get students to turn on their cameras and to have verbal exchanges online in the same way that they will in the classroom. But if you try and do as much through text and chat as you can, and ask questions which get them typing just 1-word or 2-word answers to get that collaboration going, then they feel much more comfortable with that kind of engagement.
I guess we should all be aware of Hilary's maxim that the student's attention span is 8 minutes online. So that should really inform our teaching in the new environment. So colleagues, thank you very much for your contributions. Thanks for your questions. I thought that was a brilliant session, brilliant webinar. Thanks for your attendance. I think we can summarize it by saying that James told us about diversity in teaching methods, as he explained about his flipped learning and active learning scenarios. Hilary told us about her very diverse student body, some of them with no prior academic attainment, lots of disabled students, and other unusual student demographics. And Dayne told us about the diverse academy out there, including Black scientists and including the white allies that Terence referred to, who mentored Dayne for his achievements. So the importance of role modeling was very important there. So diverse academy, diverse students, and a very diverse teaching method. So I think we covered a lot of the bases to conform with the title of today's webinar, Diversity in Teaching. And I'd like to draw this webinar to a close. Thank you for your attention. I hope everybody has a lovely day. Stay safe, everybody. Goodbye.